From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. In Westminster, the overflowing benches of Labour MPs are getting used to hearing this.
I now call the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer.
But the slimmer band of Conservatives won't be hearing this introduction for long.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
We know Rishi Sunak is only holding the fort. He will be stepping down at some point, triggering that near-annual tradition now, a Conservative leadership contest. This one, though, in the fallout of a massive election defeat, and with their arch-tormentor Nigel Farage in the Commons with them. And the squabbling has already begun. The Times had the scoop yesterday of Kemi Badenoch taking a swipe at Rishi Sunak for his decisions during the election, and someone else has lobbed one of the rudest insults in the party at Robert Jenrick, calling him a centrist. The story today: what now for the Tories?
I'm Stephen Swinford and I'm the political editor of The Times, and I'm joining you from the heart of Westminster. I can see Big Ben in front of me. I'm on the roof terrace outside The Times' office.
And it's been quite an exciting week, is that fair to say? In Westminster, lots of newbies turning up. What's the atmosphere like walking around the past few days?
It's an extraordinary atmosphere. You've literally got hundreds of brand new people, fresh faces that have never been here before. They're getting inducted. They're all hot desking. They're kind of trying to find their lockers. It's got a real energy to it. A lot of people kind of just trying to find the ropes because this is a pretty extraordinarily antiquated place to work. And there's been a lot of activity on the terrace in the evenings, a lot of drinking, socialising, because it's a whole group of new people like getting to know each other for the first time, predominantly Labour people.
Yes, yet there's also things that the Tory side need to sort out. Now, there have been predictions of Tory decline and fall in this election for weeks and weeks and weeks, but now it's actually happened. I wonder how quickly, after that exit poll on Thursday night, did you start to get a sense of manoeuvres afoot from would-be challengers? I mean, how quick off the mark were they?
They've been quite slow because a lot of the people that would have been engaged in manoeuvres, and there has been a lot of manoeuvring behind the scenes for a long time, but they suddenly found themselves engaged in existential fights for their own seats. So even people, let's say Kemi Badenoch, who had a thwonking majority of 27,000 before, James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, former Home Secretary, had a similar majority. They suddenly found themselves towards the end of the campaign worried that they could lose their own seats. So all of the normal kind of leadership engagement stopped, and they just went into a kind of fight for survival. Now that's ended, we are going to see this week, next week, and in coming weeks, more and more activity. And you're already seeing Suella Braverman putting in some very heavy brickbats from the right on Robert Jenrick, another candidate on the right, and it's getting quite knives out over there already. But for most of them, they haven't formally started yet, and you will start to see that in coming days. They will start coming out. You'll see a drumbeat of op-eds and interviews as they try to kind of assert their positions.
And we'll get into some of those runners and riders in a moment. But first of all, what is the party having to rebuild from? What state has the election left the Tory party in? I mean, just in terms of how many are in the rank and file, but also what political flavour they are.
They've been ripped to shreds. I mean, it's not as bad as some of the scenarios were. There were suggestions in some of the polls they could be reduced to as few as 60 MPs. They probably have enough MPs to form a viable opposition, but it's only just and kind of there, but for the grace of God. So you've got around 120 Tory MPs, and we've been through them all. And what I can tell you is that the party is much more centrist than it was before. So there's a lot to play for, but it does feel like if it wants it, the One Nation group, which is the big centrist grouping of Tory MPs, probably holds the whip hand for this forthcoming leadership contest. But it won't surprise you to hear that Nigel Farage's Reform Party has eaten a lot of Tory votes, but it's particularly consumed right-wing Tory MPs. A lot of them are out entirely and have gone. So it didn't just split the boat. It was very effective at killing off the very people who have a similar ideology to it over Brexit and right-wing issues.
Yeah, I mean, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and much more besides. In terms of actually how this contest would get going, Rishi Sunak does have to depart the scene first, doesn't he? I mean, what has he said about what he's going to do or not do in the coming weeks or maybe months?
Well, a lot of it hinges on how long the contest is. So he's obviously stood down as Prime Minister. We have Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, but he remains as Tory leader. And the candidates ideally would like him to stay for as long as possible to facilitate an orderly transition. The problem is that the candidates seem to be coalescing towards a long contest, which seems insane, but they are talking about a contest which could last until after, all the way through to conference season, which would be a beauty parade of some form. And then after that, you'd eventually get a new Tory leader. So you've got this enormous period they're talking about. It might not be to the end of the year that we get a new Tory leader. Now, Rishi Sunak has made clear he's willing to help, but he's also told friends he doesn't want to hang around beyond September. So you've got a problem. You'll probably need a new interim leader. And it's worth remembering what it is that Rishi Sunak is being asked to do here. So he endured an election campaign, which was arguably one of the worst election campaigns in history. Every day he was castigated by everyone. Every day he was reminded of or told of his own failings and criticised for them left, right and centre. He now enters a period where he is going to be asked to do Prime Minister's questions on a regular basis, where he's going to be asked to hold together a shadow cabinet that is fraying, forgive the bells, that's an occupational hazard in Westminster, that he's going to have to hold together a shadow cabinet that is going to be at odds with each other. They're all going to be fighting over different visions, and he's going to be a punching bag. Let's not make any bones about this. He is. They are going to be criticising him, his premiership, the decisions he made as they set out their own visions for the future. And for a man that spent much of his life being accustomed to winning, he was the head boy at Winchester. He had a very successful financial career. I'm not sure he's going to enjoy that too much. So I imagine he'll stick it around, but there will come a point when he has to go, and then you maybe have to get an interim leader, someone like an Ian Duncan Smith or another grandee to fill in the breaches for a period.
So how might this timeline for electing a new leader actually get nailed down? Who decides?
It is a game of two halves, effectively. You have the 1922 committee, that is the committee of backbench Tory MPs, and they are responsible for the MPs side of the contest. So they had a very messy election of a new leader because their previous ones were all lost, their executive committee. So Bob Blackman is the new leader of the 1922 committee. Now, that wasn't without controversy because they failed to kind of tell people when to vote. So lots of people turned up and they weren't able to vote and said that the rules were bent and it was corrupt. But nonetheless, you now have a leader of the 22 who is in place. Their job is to take all of the field of, let's say we're going to get 7 leadership candidates, and to whittle it down to 2. And those 2 are then put to Conservative Party members across the country in a process that can take months. And you get these prospective candidates touring the country, debating each other, meeting with local associations, and it all then becomes about the members. And that is the process that led us to Liz Truss last time over Rishi Sunak.
And in terms of the length of that contest, as discussed, I guess the competing visions are we need time to properly diagnose what went wrong and come up with some answers and a proper leader who can turn things around. That's the maybe we should take this all the way to post-conference, maybe back end of the year argument. Or there's the we need a united sharp front, sharpish, to stand opposite Rachel Reeves when she delivers her budget and to push back on Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Questions every week. Which do you think is the politically best?
I think it's difficult and it's obviously subjective, but I would have thought there is surely a benefit in trying to have someone in place for the autumn statement and to make sure that Conservative Party conference, one of the few times voters actually listen to you, you've got a leader in place. But like I say, they do seem to be heading towards a longer contest. Now, the advantage of that, as you say, is that you can thrash out ideas, you can properly test the mettle of the candidates. But the disadvantage of that is that it obviously presents a disunited front. You're going to have more Tory psychodrama. You're going to have more Tories going for each other. And it clears the pitch completely for Labour. It means that Labour can set the narrative. It can set the tone for what's to come. And in 2010, that's exactly what the Tories did to Labour. While Labour was in decimation, the Miliband brothers were fighting each other, all getting a bit Cain and Abel. The Tories were able to set a narrative which said they spent all the money, there was none left. And you can be sure as hell that is exactly what Labour's going to do. So there are risks to going long. I guess there are advantages. There is an argument that no one is going to listen to anything the Tories have to say for at least a year anyway. So why not go long to make sure you have a proper contest and get a proper leader? This is a long game here. But either way, I think there is a real risk that the Tories descend into brutal internecine warfare yet again. And obviously disunited parties don't win elections.
Yes. And who are, to your mind, the most interesting runners and riders?
So Kemi Badenoch is obviously going to be a kind of key front runner. She managed to unite people of completely different political persuasions. Can she do that again? The downside is that some colleagues think that she's too abrasive, too aggressive.
You are making statements in a select committee that are untrue.
You've just called me a liar. Can I just remind the Minister that is unparliamentary?
Right. What she has said is not true. It's not true.
The upside is that some colleagues think that's exactly what you need now. You need someone who is going to take the fight to Labour. She's got a proven track record of doing that. So that's Kemi Badenoch. She's got to be an early front runner. On the other side of the party, Tom Tugendhat, who is the security minister. He's a centrist. He's definitely looking a likely candidate.
We recognise that Palestinians are suffering too. Thousands have been killed in this conflict. Over 1 million have been displaced. We know that Hamas are using innocent Palestinian children, civilians, and others as human shields.
And like I said, the party is more centrist, so he will be pushing back against culture wars issues, that kind of thing, and saying that we need to focus on taking the fight to Labour. And he has the advantage of being relatively untainted by the previous government because he was in the role of security minister. He wasn't one of the great officers of state or anything like that. So he's definitely a contender. Also coming through the middle, you're going to have James Cleverly.
Under the Conservatives, we've not only recruited 20,000 new police officers, we're committed to recruiting an additional 8,000 full-time, fully warranted police officers embedded in communities around the country.
So he is a Brexiteer, but he's also seen as a kind of safe pair of hands, done Foreign Secretary, done Home Secretary, is able to attract those centrists probably as well. So he's a possibility. And then you've got people like Priti Patel.
Mr. Speaker, before I answer today's questions and start questions, if I may, I'd briefly like to remark on the last 3 years of Boris Johnson's Prime Ministership, under which I've served as Home Secretary. This morning, a written ministerial statement...
People assume that she is a right-winger, and she is, but she's done a very good job in reaching out to centrists. And you would be surprised by the number of One Nationals or centrist Tories that speak warmly to me about Priti Patel and her potential as a unifying figure. And she's played quite a good game because she's not, unlike Suella Braverman, she's not been out there, she's not been outspoken, she's not been banging the drum on the right. She has been quietly going about her business, kind of whining and dining people and playing the game quite well that way. So she could come through the middle as a unity candidate of some form. And then you've obviously got on the right, you've got Robert Jenrick.
We have the levers within our hands to control our borders and our legal migration system. But the decisions that were taken by the then ministers, unfortunately, created a system which was far too liberal. And that was an insult to the British public.
Who is attempting to position himself as someone put it to me, someone with the policies of Nigel Farage, but the kind of presentational skills of David Cameron, the acceptable face of right-wing politics in the Conservative Party. And he is going like head-to-head right now. They're kind of duking it out with Suella Braverman, who is going very hard right.
And here we are trying to explore those ideas, me talking about rights radicalism and the totally unreasonable way in which human rights have taken over and stymied the government's ability to stop the boats. We now need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights.
She put in her obituary for the Conservative Party before the election result was even announced. She wrote a piece saying, there's been a terrible campaign, we need to cede defeat, it's done. So you've got Suella Braverman going kind of hammer and tongs on the right of the party, even attacking Robert Jenrick. And those two are going to fight for the right-wing vote. Now, what right-wing MPs are hoping is that the two of them will reach an accommodation, but at the moment, it doesn't look likely.
In terms of the actual runners and riders that we are thinking about, Kemi Badenoch, the former business minister, is someone that lots of people have got their eye on, now part of Sunak's interim shadow cabinet, of course. And as you've been reporting, there was this first meeting of the shadow cabinet recently. Plenty of warm words, it seems, around the table for the former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And then they got to Kemi Badenoch, and she had her say.
So let me take listeners inside the room. Shadow Cabinet is now meeting in the bowels of Parliament. There's no kind of glamorous cabinet room with a long table anymore. It's kind of here where I am in Westminster. And you had a succession of shadow cabinet ministers speak. So Rishi Sunak opened, he apologised, he said, "This is on me, I take responsibility, it's my fault." And then lots of people around the cabinet table praised him. Jeremy Hunt hailed his work ethic. Mel Stride said he owes Rishi Sunak a huge debt of personal gratitude. John Glenn said that he had taken a poisoned chalice on behalf of the whole party. So it was all very pleasant. And while this was happening, Kemi Badenoch was effectively sitting there, I was told, and stewing. She could not understand what was happening. We are on the other side, this is what people suggest to me, of a landslide election defeat, and yet no one is realising the enormity of it. So when it was her turn to speak, she didn't hold back. Like I say, she was 7th or 8th, and she'd heard a lot of people go before her. And so she kind of addressed the elephant in the room and went for it. She said that Rishi Sunak's election campaign had been pretty much disastrous. She highlighted the D-Day failings. She said that the fact that Rishi Sunak's PPS had placed a bet on the date of the election was ridiculous. She said he was a buffoon. And it kind of just went on and on. So she launched this extraordinary series of criticisms. She said that Suella Braverman, the former Home Secretary, appeared to be on the brink of a nervous breakdown. It was a very trenchant criticism. And she also said that it's really important that Shadow Cabinet doesn't leak. But of course, it always leaks, and it always has leaked. And word reached me of what had happened and the discussion that they'd had shortly afterwards.
Obviously, part of the pitch is not just you laying out what your vision is for party members and your fellow Conservative MPs, but also, I guess, you have to put a bit of distance between yourself and the last government. James Cleverly had a prominent role in the last Tory government. Kemi Badenoch had a prominent role in the last Tory government and are in this new shadow cabinet that Rishi Sunak has announced, this interim shadow cabinet. How bad a smell is that to have round you, do you think, if you're pitching for the leadership?
I think it's difficult if you were part of it. I think, so James Cleverly will point to his record in the Home Office, the fact that he was a completely safe pair of hands there. There weren't major issues on his watch, but people on the right will say, look, migration soared under with you as Home Secretary. You failed on that. And I think broadly, you're going to get two phases, right? Robert Jenrick is a classic of the genre. At the weekend, he went out saying that we got everything wrong. We failed to deliver on all fronts.
We did not deliver the level of growth and taxation that Conservatives expect, the quality of service in the NHS that the public need, and above all, the secure borders and controlled and reduced migration that we promised and which we need to deliver.
So you get the assessment or the analysis of what went wrong in very stark kind of, we're terrible, and then they will give their prescriptions for that, which will differ. So on the right of the party, they will say it's because we didn't go hard enough on migration. It's because we didn't go hard enough on tax. It's because, all of these right-wing issues we didn't do enough on. The centrists will be arguing, well, no, it's the opposite, that actually you can't win from that platform. You have to win from the centre ground. And actually, there could be arguments that look at what Keir Starmer did, right? That's where voters are, and you need to address their concerns. But what voters don't want is issues like culture wars, that kind of stuff. So you'll get a balance between them. But like you say, it is an issue for people who have played prominent roles in the government in the past.
Stephen, yet another Tory leadership contest is afoot. I mean, it's almost as regular as Christmas at this point. You've been taking us through some of the arguments and some of the would-be candidates. We've mentioned him already. I wonder what you think the impact and influence will be of Nigel Farage and his actual MPs who he now has on those green benches and in those corridors. Do you think he will have much influence? Will he have many strings to pull in this context?
I think he'll be a constant figure and a constant pressure. So if you look at the candidates at the moment, all of them have ruled out doing a deal with Nigel Farage. The only one that hasn't is Suella Braverman, who has said that we should be talking to Reform and working with them. But it will hang over the contest because an enormous number of disaffected Tory voters went to Reform. And the question now is that a permanent shift, or is this something that the Tories can win back? And I think as the kind of campaign gathers momentum, that question of would you do a deal with Farage, is there one to be done there, will become louder and louder. And he will obviously have views on all the candidates and will be unhelpfully attacking them from the sidelines as they go through this. And I think, OK, so Reform only has 5 MPs. That is a fact, but that is a product with the first past the post system. It picked up 4.5 million votes. It picked up more than the Liberal Democrats, and that is an electoral force. And certainly when you get to the second stage of the contest, which is with grassroots Tories, questions around Farage, his views, his policies, his approach are going to kind of come to the fore again. So Farage is going to be a very difficult factor as the Tories try to reassess. And look, there are lots of people in Reform. I don't think Farage actually is one of them, but there are lots of people in Reform that want to destroy the Conservative Party and to replace it in the long term. I've not heard that language directly coming from Farage, but there is a longer game afoot here that in 5 years' time, they want to be the dominant force on right-wing politics. And the risk is that by having a long contest, you give Farage space and time to establish himself as the kind of bastion of right-wing small c conservatism, the guy that's standing up to Labour in the Commons.
There's no enthusiasm for Starmer whatsoever. In fact, about half of the vote is simply an anti-Conservative vote. This Labour government will be in trouble very, very quickly. We will now be targeting Labour votes. We're coming for Labour, be in no doubt about that.
The longer you leave it without an effective opposition leader, the more of a role there is for him in British politics.
Because even still at the moment, in some parts of the internet, clips of speeches that he gave whilst an MEP in the European Parliament still pop up, him thumping the table and, decrying the decision of some European leader on this or that.
I know that virtually none of you have ever done a proper job in your lives, or worked in business, or worked in trade, or indeed ever created a job. But listen, just listen.
So actually having the platform of the Commons, do you think that will give him a boost, which he hasn't already had in his long career?
I definitely do. What it's also worth reflecting is the Nigel Farage we saw during this election campaign is what I would call Nigel Farage 2.0. This is Nigel Farage who, post all of the stuff he's done with Trump, has a huge social media following. He is operating and cutting across in ways that he didn't before. And it goes beyond money and funding, actually, because if you've got that kind of a personal brand, a personal platform, you can use it. And Parliament will only add to that. And don't forget, you've also got, obviously, the US elections in November. And those elections, if Trump is to win, I imagine that link with Farage will become more and more prominent, and he will use that and play on that. And you could end up in a position where the leader of the free world is an ally of Nigel Farage, all of which presents problems for the Conservative Party.
So if Reform and Farage are just going to inflate even further, do you think it's actually landed in the minds of Conservative MPs that actually they are a diminished force, not just in number, but also, I guess, in their campaigning ability, their fundraising ability? I mean, that they are a shadow of their former selves, and that will actually undermine their ability to rebuild. Do you think they've had that realisation yet, Conservative MPs?
I do think they have. I think it was an extraordinary shock to the system. It's one thing to say the polls are looking really bad. It's another thing for that to become a reality. But the problem for them is they're still so ideologically divided as a party. Last time I counted, there are 7 potential candidates for the Tory leadership, which seems insane. So the concern I would have for them is that old instinct of fratricide and psychodrama, and we're still even seeing it play out today.
Marcus Fish, the now former Conservative MP, said that if the Conservative Party were a business, we'd wind it up. It's got that bad. Do you think existential questions, which were hanging around the Conservative Party in the general election campaign every time one of these new enormous polls dropped, do you think they're still hanging over the party now, or have we moved on from that?
It has enough, like I say, it defied the worst case scenarios. It got enough MPs to form an effective opposition. It didn't get left with a rump of 60. So I don't think it's quite existential. I think the thing that everyone can take from this election is, yes, it is a huge landslide for Labour. Yes, it potentially sets them up for 10 or 15 years in government. But it also just shows once again the volatility of the electorate. that in a lot of seats there were very narrow margins of victory, that we have gone from a position where, you know, in 2021, Keir Starmer was on the brink of resignation, Boris Johnson was looking at a 2-term premiership, and we know what transpired in the interim, and it all collapsed and everything changed. Things can change. Weighing against that is the enormity of this majority that Labour has. And I think one of the things the Tories will struggle with is trying to stay relevant. If they disappear into themselves, as they're probably quite likely to do during a leadership contest, power moves in the most quick and brutal way, and it already has this week. The removal men, they leave with all Sunak stuff, they come in with all Starmer stuff. The civil servants clap out Rishi Sunak as he leaves. There are emotional scenes, there are tears, and then a couple of hours later, they clap in Keir Starmer. There are hugs, there are celebrations, and it just moves with such brutal efficiency, and the power goes. And that's what they are going to be struggling with. They are going to have a fight to stay relevant.
Just finally, Stephen, I know political gambling isn't exactly in vogue in Westminster at the moment. But if you're a betting man, I mean, where are you going to put your money on this leadership race?
I would have thought that Kemi Badenoch has a shot, a good shot, and I would have thought, you know, Priti Patel has a shot, and maybe Tom Tugendhat. It depends where James Cleverly goes and what he does. But those were at the moment, based on people that I know are definitely going to stand, I'd probably put those three at the top of it. I'm not sure the right of the party will have the numbers, but then if Robert Jenrick can broaden his appeal sufficiently, he could be in with a shot. But at the moment, you'd be somewhere between Badenoch, Patel and Tugendhat, I would have thought.
Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Stephen Swinford, political editor for The Times. His scoops and analysis are all at thetimes.com, obviously just for subscribers. Subscribe to our feed for free on the app you're listening to us on. If you like, it means you won't miss a single episode. It means you won't miss Matt Lawton tomorrow, our sports correspondent, on possibly the next leadership contest, depending on how the match goes. Should England replace Gareth Southgate? Today's producer was Olivia Case. The executive producer was Will Rowe. Sound design was by Tom Birchall. And theme composition was by Mal Assetto. I'm Luke Jones. See you tomorrow.